South Africa's history is clouded by the horrors of colonialism, racism, socialism, and violence. Yet its largest city, Johannesburg, is one of the financial centers of the world, poised to bring new opportunity for all. I traveled across 2 hemispheres to explore the troubled history of apartheid and to talk to South Africans fighting for a future of freedom and equality. Hey, we just arrived in Johannesburg, South Africa, and we're going to the Apartheid Museum. If you know anything about the culture and the politics of South Africa, you know that everything has been defined by race and the government's discrimination against black people, legalized racism here in this country, so infamous in the 1980s and 1990s. Mandela is released from prison.
Mr. Nelson Mandela, a free man, taking his first steps into a new South Africa.
We're going to check out all this stuff. We start at the Apartheid Museum. We're going to go to his hometown of Soweto, one of those neighborhoods created by the apartheid government to segregate blacks from the rest of civil society. We're going to drink some beer, and most awesome, we're going to be hanging out with free market reformers from across Africa who are trying to make sure that liberty and peace and prosperity is accessible to everybody in this country. To be free is not merely to cast off one's chains, but to live in a way that respects and enhances the freedom of others. Nelson Mandela. That, of course, was the ethos of the peaceful revolution that Nelson Mandela led, that led to more democracy, the breakdown of apartheid, and a different way of thinking about things. In a sense, he was the George Washington of modern South Africa. At the Apartheid Museum, you're randomly selected as white or non-white. I've been selected as non-white, so I'm going to get a sense for what it was like to be segregated separately based on the state's edict.
I do have memories of apartheid, although in the 1980s the system of petty apartheid, so forcing people to sit in separate benches and park, this would have been a segregated area. That system was starting to unravel, and there were some reforms that were taking place. The real catalyst was the release of Nelson Mandela and other freedom fighters from Robben Island and from prison in the early 1990s. And then the first democratic elections were in 1994.
Remember, at that time, black people had been economically castrated by the apartheid administration, and so they tended to see themselves as have-nots, and so that's how we saw ourselves. And so it was like Karl Marx was talking to us, and so that went on for quite a while.
So we're heading to Soweto Township this morning, south of central Johannesburg, infamous as one of the places where the apartheid government forced black people who had been living inside the city. They took their property, moved them to the south in hopes of keeping the races separate. It also happens to be the place where there was not one, but 2 Nobel Prize winners. Both Nelson Mandela and Desmond Tutu lived in Soweto. We're going to get to the bottom of the story today. We've just arrived in Kliptown, South Africa, outside of Soweto, and this is a special place. There's a lot of really important symbolism. The pillars in this tower over here represent the informal nature of this gathering place. This was not really a legal place to gather, and yet black people gathered here. It also happens to be the place where legally in 1994 they were allowed to vote for the very first time. As you can imagine, this is a sacred place. This is a special place. This is where democracy started to function in post-apartheid South Africa.
What started as a peaceful protest degenerated into a rampage and later exploded into a bloody conflagration.
We're at the Hector Peterson Museum in Soweto. He is the student, the 13-year-old student who was shot in 1976 by the government during a student uprising.
The apartheid government introduced apartheid as a medium of instruction in all the schools. Now the students decided on the day to protest against the imposition of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in the schools. It was just supposed to be a peaceful march from all the schools of Soweto to Orlando police station. The police barricaded the road, so the student could not move any further, and there was a congestion. And we are told that the police were overwhelmed by the students, and they panicked and opened fire. A 13-year-old boy was shot dead by the police. His name is Hector Peterson. He was the first victim of the 1976 student uprising. What the students did, because they did not have guns, they went to all the government buildings within the townships. They were all set alight.
That one photo galvanized a global movement against apartheid. The photo of dying Hector Peterson. The photographer that took that photo was detained by the police, but he knew what he had. He hid the footage in his sock and smuggled it out of the country. So this is Nelson Mandela's home. He lives on the same street as Desmond Tutu. I'm going in to check it out.
South Africa was declining during the final years of apartheid, and then under Mandela we started rising on all of these indices. We became more free, there was privatization, liberalization, and the economy grew. Then unfortunately about 10 years after the transition we plateaued off, and now we are declining. We are tumbling again on all of these indices. Now that is partly due to the ruling alliance, the African National Congress Alliance, the ANC, Mandela's party, collapsing internally. It's internally falling apart.
South Africa's president seems out of step with many in his own party, a politician in survival mode, facing anger and sustained protests from the people.
And they are desperately trying to survive, and they are promising voters that if they vote for them, they will get all the wealth, the ill-gotten wealth of white people. They will take their land and give it to black people.
So you knew I was going to do it. I found my first craft beer in Johannesburg, and this one's actually from Cape Town to the south of here, and it is delicious. We've also gotten into our first political row. We were supposed to go with property rights reformers tomorrow to a small village where they would convey formal deed and title to the houses that people are living in. Part of the reforms post-apartheid was giving individuals property rights, but without the formal title, they can't pass that property on to their kids and their grandkids. The ANC, the government here in South Africa, discovered that this was going to happen, and they shut it down. We were told that it would be unsafe to go on with this ceremony, so we're not going to do that. But we're going to find a way to talk to property rights advocates and the recipients in these villages anyway. In the meantime, I'm having a beer.
Central to the crisis in our country are the massive divisions and inequalities left behind by apartheid. But the day of reckoning against all these people who are responsible for your problems, for the problems that you have mentioned to us. The 27th of April next year is the day of reckoning. We are going to bury the National Party.
Nelson Mandela was elected the first black president here in South Africa in 1994, and the promise was about equality and equal treatment under the law, and economic prosperity spread across the population regardless of whether or not you were born black or white.
He is the symbol of resistance. He is the symbol of the African National Congress. He is the symbol of the hope of this country.
But today there's a crisis, because attached to that promise is a promise that you own your own property, that you can control your own destiny. And so many black South Africans don't have clear title to their own homes, even though they've lived there their entire lives. Maybe their parents did before them.
I'm working on the KLM Land Reform Project, which was a project that we initiated in 2010, but it took over 2.5 years of negotiations with the local municipality in order to convince them of the importance of property rights and why it is important to restore dignity to the members of their community.
So in 1913, the government of the time, which was a very new government in terms of South Africa, as we know today, only came about in 1910 as a unified state. They imposed a very pernicious piece of legislation called the Land Act, and that robbed black people of title over their land and any rights that they had over their property. And that was designed in order to support migrant labor flows to Johannesburg, which was built on the back of the mining industry. And that legacy we still live with today. And today many black people still don't enjoy private property rights, even though they have resided in an informal home for many, many years. For all intents and purposes, that home is theirs, but they don't have the legal backing to support that.
So there've been two poster children of the KLM Land Reform Project. One of them is Mrs. Maria Matupi, who received the title deed to her property in 2013 when she was 99 years old. She's not the only person. There's Sana Shabalala, who also received the title deed to her property when she was 100 years old. That's the focus of this project.
The fundamental nature of racism in South Africa was very much premised on the government deciding who could associate with who based on the color of your skin. It was not a free market system. It was exactly opposite of that. Everything was regulated from the top down. Everything was about social control and social engineering. Racism, when you think about it, is the ultimate collectivist ideology. It defines people based on the color of their skin, treats everybody as a group, not as an individual, not based on the content of their character, as Martin Luther King so famously said. I think the key to understanding the solution here is breaking down those barriers, making sure that there's property rights, that there's rights for people to associate with each other regardless of who they are, where they came from.
I think we are moving into being a mature democracy where people who go to the polls don't vote along racial lines, but they choose which party to vote for on the basis of that party's policies. And in the process, we will get very radical parties, fascist parties, libertarian or liberal parties, free market parties, but my best guess is we will move back towards more of a free market, capitalistic, liberal, classical liberal paradigm. That's what I expect to happen. It might not, but either way I think we will have gone through a cathartic process, which is a good thing and long overdue, and I'm in favor of. So I'm a bit of a Pollyanna. I'm quite cheerful about the problems that other people see in South Africa.